Hello and welcome to the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other Indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakpadan watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
Good afternoon. I am joined today by Eric Buffalohead, who will be partaking in the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. Good afternoon, Eric.
Good afternoon.
To begin, your first question for today is when and for how long have you lived or worked in the area around Bassett Creek?
Well, quite a long time. I moved to St. Louis Park in 1979, so I would have been in 8th grade. And I lived, right south of there in St. Louis Park, right across 394, from 79 until probably around 95, when I was in grad school or finishing up grad school and got married, and then went to St. Paul for a while, and then we started sending our kids to Breck in 96, I think it was. And eventually we moved, me and my wife, to Plymouth. Okay. And we lived in Plymouth until 2016 after our twins graduated from Breck. So we were in the area for a long time,
Where do you
35
live?
years.
Where do you live now?
I'm in Burnsville now.
Oh, you kind of went to the other side of the metro area.
Yeah, we went south. When we got married, we lived in student housing on the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota, and then we lived in Minneapolis for a while, and then lived in St. Paul for a while, and then eventually went out to Plymouth. But then my wife took a job at Blue Cross, which was in Egan, so we decided to reduce her commute after the kids finished Breck. So there was no real reason to stay out there anymore.
Right.
So we decided to move closer to where she worked. She didn't work there anymore, but we just decided to stay in the South Metro because we've got a nice place we like and it's an easy commute.
Good. So you mentioned that you moved to St. Louis Park with your family when you were a youngster. Do you know what brought your family to that area?
I think it was that we came back to Minnesota after spending some time in Washington and Colorado because my dad was a prof like me, and we decided it was time to come back to Minnesota, and he just wasn't real impressed with the Minneapolis or St. Paul schools where I had gone to elementary school. So I decided I think it would be best to live in the burbs where I'd probably get a better opportunity to prepare myself for college, and I think that was probably true. I share his sentiments. I'm not real impressed with the Minneapolis or St. Paul public schools. Mm-hmm. That's why I sent my kids to Breck when we lived in St. Paul, and then eventually when we moved to Plymouth, to make Breck on the way for me to work and from home back to home to make it easier for the commute and stuff rather than going from St. Paul over to Golden Valley and then back to Minneapolis. Did that for a few years and decided that was crazy. So, it was really about education, the schools, and getting ready, for me to be a college student or whatever. And so they wanted a good high school for me and for my younger sister.
So when you were school age, where did you go to school?
In St. Louis Park?
Yeah.
Or when I was younger. Well, I went to school in a lot of places. I mean, we started in Minneapolis because my dad was a prof at the U. And so we lived in the southeast by the university, walking distance from the university. So we lived there through 3rd grade. And then we went up to Washington and then eventually to Colorado. And then for 8th grade came back to Minnesota. So I went to school at St. Louis Park Junior High, and then I went to St. Louis Park Senior High, which was a 4-year senior high school. We were the first class to be integrated in to the 4-year high school experience in St. Louis Park. So I went 1 year junior high in St. Louis Park and 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade at St. Louis Park High School. So, yeah, that's where I went. And then, was in the area doing a lot of stuff.
I guess I didn't even realize that St. Louis Park had its own high school.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, because, Golden Valley is part of the Hopkins School District.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just kind of different because Hopkins is a really small suburb, but it's this huge school that includes parts of Minnetonka and all of Hopkins and Golden Valley. So, yeah, St. Louis Park is still its own district. It's not a real big suburban area, but it was nice. I liked living there. It was cool. My mom still lives in the same house that they moved into in 82. So we moved there before 82, but they ended up buying a place in 82 and still live in the same house.
So, and thinking about your education and then your children's education when they were at Breck, what did their education or your education look like in terms of Indian education, programming, and the K through 12 years?
Nothing. There's nothing. We learned absolutely nothing about Native Americans in my entire, primary and secondary and high school education. We learned nothing. In fact, I'm a professor, so I often tell my students about my experience in American history in 10th grade, and we spent 9 months and hour a day in American history, and we only talked about American Indians one day in that whole 9 months, and that was the Custer thing. And of course, he made it out for us to be the bad guy in that whole that whole thing. So nothing. There was nothing that we ever learned about Native Americans in any of my education. In fact, I was often called upon to be the teacher. As a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old when any questions ever came up about anything. So yeah, it was bad. And I would say that for the kids, it was, maybe a little bit better, but, not really. That didn't, Breck doesn't really have an Indian Ed program. And like, say, Osseo or Minneapolis or St. Paul has an Indian Ed program, right, where they actually have curriculum and requirements. So Breck, there was some stuff about natives in American history and Minnesota history, but it was pretty bad, and oftentimes it was kind of inaccurate in some ways or problematic, confusing of historical figures in the history books, and I was pretty upset with the 7th grade history teacher because the teacher refused to acknowledge that there were 2 Chief Josephs among the Nez Perce. There was Old Joseph and Young Joseph. And the history book confused that for the students. And I just started to be, I said, hey, you know what? I teach American history at the university. And I know there's 2 Josephs and your book is wrong. And I would appreciate it if you shared with the students that there were actually 2 Josephs, and that the Joseph who refused to sign the 1863 treaty, which gave up the Wallowa Valley, wasn't the same Joseph who led the Nez Perce War in 1877, even though they had the same name. And teacher refused. I can't contradict the book. I'm like, even though it's obviously wrong, So I wasn't real impressed with their stuff. And when things got problematic for my sons and Grant, who were all in the same grade, we had to do like an in-service. Me and Grant's father, the Reverend Robert Tubles, had to come in and do like an in-service for the students on Native Americans and all this kind of stuff and stereotypes. And so really anything that happened kind of fell upon the parents to take care of. Only thing they ever wanted to do was see us as dress-up Indians, have somebody set up a teepee in May for Minnesota Indian Month, and let's have the students do a exhibition of powwow dancing or something. And I'm just kind of like, that's fine, but what about some real information too?
Right.
You're just making us into what a stereotype already prevails for people. They only recognize us if we're in our regalia or in some in a teepee or something. They don't recognize us as contemporary people. So I wasn't real impressed with them, and I don't think they do much better today. I'm not real impressed with them today either, but I didn't send them there to learn about natives. I sent them there to college.
Right.
So, I mean, I figured, hey, I can do the whole native thing. Me and my wife, we can kind of help them out there. Since I am American Indian Studies professor, I can share some of that information with them and help them out and stuff. So, but again, it wasn't about, hey, I want them to go to a strong school district with a real strong Indian Ed program. I want them to go to a district, or I want them to go to school where they can go to college and make it be easy and not be a struggle, because we all know how important higher ed is.
Right.
Especially for natives.
Right. Yeah, I feel like regardless of where so many students go to school, they just lack any kind of American Indian history or curriculum in general. Almost regardless of if there's an outside Indian education program that they are pulled from class to participate in, or if they're in a private school where we generally assume there's more money and teaching expertise as well.
Yeah, I mean, I teach American Indian Studies at Augsburg, and so teach Introduction to American Indian Studies every semester, and I get the same comments from students. It's like, how come I had to come to college to learn about Native Americans?
Right.
Yeah, go ask your school board, I guess.
I agree. I teach Intro to American Indian Studies here at the University of Wisconsin, and it's the same questions every semester, and students are eager to learn it too. So it really is unfortunate that they're not getting it earlier.
It is. And then, some of the things I hear is, well, they're too young for the negative stuff. And it's like, well, it's not all negative. There's a lot of positive things we teach about natives, all the foods and ideas and thoughts and medicines and all the words and everything that we have contributed to America. That can all be painted in a positive way. I mean, yeah, I probably shouldn't talk about Sand Creek or something to fourth graders, but there's a lot of things you could do to set the table for them to learn about us. And like in Minnesota, why is there an Indian in the state seal? I mean, it's just kind of like there's an Indian riding away. It's like, well, what's the meaning of that? What's the point of it? You're living in the state of Minnesota. You got to have some idea why the state flag and the state seal has an Indian on a horse riding away or whatever. But most people just, I didn't even realize it was there. It's like, well, maybe you should take a closer look.
Yeah. Take some of our classes.
Yeah, you should take some American Indian Studies classes. So, yeah, I mean, that's the thing I run into. Why did I have to wait till this point to learn this? And, it's like, well, I agree with you. You shouldn't have. If it was up to me, we'd have American Indian curriculum, all the way through high school. And so give people a baseline so they could be informed and, start to dispel or at least understand why the stereotypes are there exist, and deal with those kinds of things.
Right. And thinking more about community, both when you were growing up and even now as an adult, or when you lived in the West Metro in particular, did you know any Native families in the community?
In high school, sure, there was one other Native family in Samples Park who had a daughter in my grade, and actually her older sister was a student of my father's at the U, so we knew them. And there was one other Native kid who lived in Minneapolis but came to St. Louis Park schools through 10th grade that I knew. But pretty much I was the only one who graduated in my class who was Native. The girl, a friend of our family, she got pregnant, dropped out, that whole unfortunate thing, never went back. So I was the only one.
Okay.
When I was in high school, there was probably one in each grade or less Native Americans. And some of them were, like one girl I knew she was Native, but I don't think she knew she was Native until she really got older because she was adopted. And it's like, look, you're Native. Look at yourself. Look in the mirror. You're obviously not a white person. Wow, maybe I'm Native. I don't know. It's like, well, come on, you look like a Native person. You're obviously a New World person. And then she actually did. I ran into her a few years ago. Did reconnect with her community. Moved up north. Turned out she was Ojibwe. And moved up north.
Okay.
To try and connect more with, who her relatives were or whatever, but there really wasn't any. And then, at Breck, there was just a few Native families there. Certainly, a core group, the Tubals were one, but there was never more than about 3 or 4 in my son's grade, and they're twins, so there were 2 of them. And then my daughter, I think there was 1 Native girl in her grade. She's like 6 years older than the boys. So.
Okay.
And then there were some other Native students. I mean, they had a parent group at Breck that did things. So there was probably about 8 or 10 families at any given time who had students there. And obviously Breck is kindergarten through high school. So when you start 8 or 10 families spread out across 12 grades, it's pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was, different things that people did. I mean, there were get-togethers and stuff, but not like a real Indian Ed program or anything. It was just, more supporting each other. And they only really wanted to involve us in recruitment of Native students. They'd have, big tadas and invite the Native community to Breck. And so we'd be there and talk about our experiences and stuff and tell people what it was like. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, this is a college prep school. That's the point of this place.
Right.
And so, if you're sending your kid here because you pretty much plan that college is a given,
right?
That's the next step. And if that's not your plan, then you probably should send your kid someplace else because this is an expensive place to go.
Right.
I mean, when we started there, my wife was still an undergrad, working on her undergrad degree, and I was, doing my dissertation. So we got, a great financial deal to go there, like 93% tuition, waived or something. So it was still a lot of money for us, though.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine paying the whole thing. Would have lasted about 2 weeks there, having to pay that much, right?
Yeah.
And so most of the students were like that. And one of the things that was I think difficult for the Native students is that there's a lot of people there who have money is like whatever, Hey, we're all going to Florida for spring break. You want to come? It's like, yeah, sure, but you got a private jet or, right. Where are we going to stay, right? So that was just, money, no object kind of thing. Kids would have their whole grade birthday parties, and they probably spent $15,000 on the party and stuff. So It was kind of weird to be a normal family.
Right.
Oh yeah, we're going to order pizza from Domino's for the birthday party.
Yeah, I feel throughout these interviews, socioeconomics have definitely come up. I think being from the Twin Cities, we think about the West Metro in particular is a more like affluent, wealthy area. But I think there's also big differences between the West Metro when we think about like Crystal Robbinsdale versus St. Louis Park and Golden Valley versus Plymouth versus Minnetonka and Wayzata. But that's something you observed as well living in the St. Louis Park area.
Oh, yeah. St. Louis Park is, there's some really wealthy people who live in St. Louis Park, too. There's the Westwood Hills area, which has got some really, really wealthy people who live there, too. So, for Breck, when the kids went to Breck, that was always a challenge, about, the money issue of what people were going to do and how much it would cost. And, just they'd have a party for a birthday party and give out gifts, and they're like $60 things to each kid, and it's like, you think of a prize for the kids at a party. I'm thinking like a $3 mini football or something.
Right.
People are giving out like Xboxes or something. Oh, here, take an Xbox. This is like, okay, it's great that you can be that generous, but in the same sense, it's just a little awkward.
Right. I agree. Similarly, in terms of socioeconomics and place in the suburbs, a lot of the conversations that I've been having, we think about housing and access to housing, why people move to the suburbs. A lot of it is about education, but for some folks, it's also about home ownership. So in your experience living in the suburbs in the West Metro, was your family able to access home ownership? Did you rent? Did you live in an apartment?
We pretty much rented until they bought that house in St. Louis Park in 82 or 84 or whatever year it was. When I was growing up, my mom didn't work. She didn't work until my sister went to school. So we had one income. Dad was a prof, and, he made good money and we did stuff, but we weren't certainly not wealthy. And since neither of my parents came from any money, there was like no grandparents or somebody to say, oh, here, I can give you $4,000 down payment on a house or something. So
right.
we were pretty much renters, and there was a lot of discrimination in the renting towards us as well. I mean, we finally figured out my mom's a white person, just send her. She'll go talk to them, and then, oh, sure, you can rent the house.
Right.
And then after the contract signed, then the rest of us would show up.
Well, I'd assume that would also be a challenge for your family with a name like Buffalohead, too.
Yeah, well, she just called up and said, hey, my name's Priscilla, and I'm going to do this and that. And, she's a white lady and shows up and looks around. You want to rent it? Sure. Okay, sure. And then, at that point, what are they going to do?
Right.
Check, oh, well, maybe I don't want to rent you or whatever. But, and I experienced stuff like that too. When I tried to rent with my last name, never get called back, or told that it's no longer for rent, and then get one of my friends to call 2 days later and they'd arrange a showing. And it's like, that's kind of why we bought a house, my wife and I, as fast as we could when we got out of university student housing. We're just like, let's just buy a house, because I don't want to go through this whole renter thing. And my wife's her family's the same way. Her dad's Native and her mom was white. It was funny because her mom used to go do the rent houses, and then they finally bought a house too. So,
but I mean, we
just started buying houses.
Right. I feel like this is so real. One of the conversations I had yesterday, the woman was talking about race-based covenants in homes, across the nation, across Minnesota, but in this region in particular, with places like Edina being very noteworthy. So this was something, racism in the housing market was something that was very real, even in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, in the West Metro, for both those seeking home ownership and in the rental market.
It was even in the real estate, because my brother-in-law, who looks like me in past, he went in to check out some real estate to become a realtor, and he was kind of told, well, if brown people come, show them Northeast Minneapolis or South Minneapolis, but don't show them these places. It's just like they were that obvious, they were that overt about it. They're not going to fit in there, they're not going to be happy there, so just show them places where they'll be happy. It's just like, so that racism is still, I think, very embedded in the structure here in the Twin Cities.
Right, to whereas when we think about redlining, we think about the 1930s, but it was still very active into the late 20th century, if not still today.
Yeah, I think there still is. I mean, there's a reason you still see the Native population in the Twin Cities kind of integrated into certain places, and seem to be left out of other places for the most part. There's certain places like Osseo. Oh, wow, there sure is a lot of natives up there, and
yeah,
St. Paul, but Edina, not so much.
Right.
Is that up? Yeah, so it's interesting, but and a lot of people don't. They don't even think about it. They don't pay attention to it because it's not something that would impact them as a white person.
Right. It's unfortunate. So you mentioned you only knew a handful of other Native people in the area. Did you live near any family growing up, or have any other family in the area today?
When I lived in Minneapolis before I moved to the West Metro, there was a lot of Natives around. When we lived in the Southeast, there was a lot of Natives around then, because obviously Minneapolis was a hotbed of change, and the U.S. American Indian Studies program, and everything that went on here in the 70s. But after we left Minneapolis, I would say not really. I mean, most of the other Native people I knew lived in Minneapolis or St. Paul when I lived in St. Louis Park. And so there were people I'd known from first or second or third grade, or people I knew through my parents and knew the kids, and they lived someplace else. And and when we lived in Plymouth, we lived in a very, very white neighborhood. Everybody was white in our neighborhood. The only place you saw people of color was in the apartment buildings that were a little south of where we lived. So I'm sure it was a shock when we moved in. And people were nice to us. They weren't racist toward us or anything, because I've experienced that in other places, but it was definitely, we were the only ones. And then even then, I'd say most of my Native friends or people I knew didn't live anywhere near where we lived in Plymouth. They lived in Minneapolis or Crystal or, someplace, St. Louis Park, someplace that was, the inner tier of the suburbs, which at that point kind of was becoming a lot browner. Because when I was a kid in St. Louis Park, it was like, there's me, there's a black kid, there was some refugee Asians who were in St. Louis Park. Other than that, everybody was white. The only thing they had for diversity is there's a lot of Jewish people in St. Louis Park. So their diversity was Jews and non-Jews, not BIPOC. Right. And that's changed a lot. That's changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. Crystals and St. Louis Parks have really become a lot more diverse, which is good for them, I think.
Yeah.
But, where we were at in Plymouth, I would say no, there was really nobody who was people of color around us at all. But we lived there for the convenience of having Breck as a stop on the way to work and on the way home from work, and not having to go through the Spaghetti Junction from St. Paul to Breck for events on a daily basis. And kids played sports, and all three of my children who went there were 3-sport athletes from 7th grade through high school, and so it just was a convenient place to live. And it was a nice big house with a nice big yard, lots of room, quiet, could have our cats go outside. So I didn't really care that much about the neighbors, whether there was a lot of natives or people of color around. I cared about the house because I could go other places for those kinds of things. I didn't, necessarily need to live in a neighborhood around other Native people. I would like to, but it's just, it wasn't in the cards in that place. And so for us, it was just about, hey, we can afford this house, and it's got 4 bedrooms.
Good location.
It's got a really big yard, and it's on a cul-de-sac, and, the kids can play outside. The cats aren't going to get run over by a car, so it'll work.
I lived in Crystal while I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. So I'd come down Highway 100 and drive past Breck every single day, but I never really knew anything about it until doing this project. Yeah, it's an interesting place. It was started actually as an Indian school. Yeah, I didn't know that either, and Grant mentioned that. I'm going to have to dig into the history of it. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting place. I would recommend people to go there. I have nothing bad to say about it. I think they could do better, but I'd probably say that about just about 99.9% of schools, including Augsburg colleges. Yeah, same is true of University of Wisconsin. So when you're in Madison, so I did my undergrad here, the PhD at Minnesota, and now I'm back at Wisconsin as a faculty member. Cool. I know Madison. I was born there. Oh. Yeah, my parents were grad students in the early 60s. So I was born there. Started my life in Madison. Wow. And I went there for 3 semesters in the 80s. Small world. But I left because it was the fall of 84, spring of 85, and fall of 85. And it was really awful to be there as a native then because of the fishing rights thing that was going on in Wisconsin. Oh, yeah. It was really bad for me because Buffalohead, right? There was a lot of people who were saying really awful things to me, and it didn't matter. And I tell them, I'm Ponca, dude. I don't have any fishing rights here. I'll say anything special more than you. I'm not Ojibwe. I'm from Oklahoma, and so it didn't matter to them. Or damn Indians, and they were just all
so unfair that you can spearfish because that makes it so easy. It's like, have you ever tried spearfishing?
Right.
Anybody who says that, I don't think has ever stood in a canoe and tried to spear a fish in the night. You want easy fishing? Get some dynamite. That's easy fishing. Ooh, that makes fishing easy. So I like the place, but just I couldn't deal with the racism that was going on at that time in the 80s, right? Because it was so ugly, and what was going on with the fishing rights in Wisconsin and all that. So, but I've been back many times and had a good time there.
So thinking about Bassett Creek and the geography of Bassett Creek as a native place, have you reflected on Bassett Creek and what it means to live in that area as a native person?
I think I reflect on that kind of thing all the time, but not necessarily about Bassett Creek. I mean, I think it's being at the Augsburg campus, a stone's throw from the Mississippi River.
Right.
Living down here in Burnsville, just south of the Minnesota River, it's like everywhere you look, there were, villages of Dakota people back in the day. And, in the northern parts of the cities, probably Ojibwe villages as well. So I think about that all the time, that here I am in the middle of country that not necessarily was Ponca. I mean, we're from northeastern Nebraska, but still, here we are in the middle of our country, and yet we own so little of it. And, there's all this push towards land acknowledgements now, and I got people emailing me up the window, what do you think of my land acknowledgement, blah, 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 blah. And they send these ridiculous things that are like pages long. It's like, you're really going to read this 3 pages? You're trying to explain the whole history of land dispossession to Native people in
3 pages.
People have written 1,000-page books on that. Why don't you just say something simple rather than trying to explain something that you don't have enough sophistication to explain? Something simple. It doesn't have to be, So, I reflect on it all the time. I just, think about it. I was like, wow, look at the view from here. I wonder what my wife's ancestors thought, who, they're Metawakanton, so they lived in the area, right? So, like, when I'm in Burnsville, if I walk up to Nicollet and start walking towards the river, I can see forever the bluff, and you can see all the way to downtown. And it's like, wow, I wonder what my wife's ancestors thought, or what they think of what they see here now, compared to what it was, right? Or to see some of the caves and the rock carvings and other things that still exist to this day that people are astounded by. It's like, well, yeah, sure, right? So I wouldn't say specifically about Bassett Creek, but just
the region,
being in this important area of, where the Mississippi and Minnesota come together, not that far from St. Croix. It must have been an incredible area of trade and activity for thousands of years, given its strategic location, right? So I think about that all the time, and I think about how most people who are here don't have any clue, right? Minnesota started in 1836 when Pig's Eye founded St. Paul. That's when history started here. It's like, no, that's when white people's written history started here.
Right.
Native people have been here for, the evidence suggests like 10,000 years they've been in the area. So, it's like, I think about that all the time.
Yeah.
And I think about how ignorant most of the population is about the land tenure and the history. My students at Augsburg are astounded when we talk about Murphy, who was a well-known land squatter who squatted on what became the areas of near downtown Minneapolis on the west side of the river, way before the 1851 treaty gave it up, right? And here we have land at Augsburg, including a park and part of our campus, which was donated by Murphy and his descendants in 1872. So here we are at Augsburg with 100 Native students and American Indian Studies program, and most of the people on the campus don't realize that there's a legitimate claim that part of our campus really is stolen land.
Right.
Murphy squatted on it, and you follow the laws of the United States. Doesn't matter that it was sold after that in a treaty. He acquired it prior to the treaty, therefore it makes it stolen property. And stolen property is supposed to revert to the original owner, right? But people don't want Augsburg. Oh, wait a minute, I don't want to talk about that. Right? No, they have done a few things. Like we used to have a building called Murphy Place. They tore that building down.
And built it with a new building with a new name?
No, I just left it blank. They just left
Okay.
the open space there. And then they used to have a restaurant called Murphy's, and they could change the name of that too, because I've been making them painfully aware of this I've been there 25 years. It's like I've been making them aware of these kinds of things. It's like, keep calling these things Murphy is just, you guys acknowledging the fact that acres of this campus are on stolen property.
Right.
Right. And there's just no court that would upheld the case, but the reality is it is on stolen property.
Right. I mean, I think there's a similar story across the nation with multiple institutions, academic and otherwise. Did I see this spring that Augsburg announced free tuition for Native students?
We have a tuition program that basically, if you make under 125,000, then we'll just charge you what you can get through Pell and whatever. So That's your tuition. So it gets rid of anything more than you can get. From financially, no student loans, just Pell Grant or tribal or whatever, and that's what you get. The rest of it is waived after that, up to 125,000. Then at 125,000, then there's a parental contribution that they're going to negotiate on a student by student basis with students. So it is quite a good deal for Native students,
right?
And we've been pushing for this for a long time, but it's like the University of Minnesota is going to do the same thing, and Morris has been doing the same thing, and there's some other schools are doing the same thing. So it's not like we're like all of a sudden so great. We just decided, well, if we want to continue to be a player in Native students in the Twin Cities, we better stay put. We better keep pace with the U and the other places that we're going to do something like this, or we're going to be left high and dry because we're very expensive. I mean, Augsburg's ridiculous priced.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully University of Wisconsin takes notice, adopts something similar.
Well, I think it's a really good program because there's so many Native students who, have the intellectual ability but are just stifled by the financial piece of it. And so I think it's a good thing we're doing at Augsburg, and I'm glad the U's doing it, and I'm glad other places are doing it. So it's good. I hope other universities follow suit, right? I mean, it'd be the right thing to do.
I totally agree.
Be the right thing to do.
So on the flip side of thinking about Bassett Creek in the region as a Dakota place, have you thought about your identity as a Native person living in a predominantly white suburb?
Well, yeah, it's something you can't really walk away from at any point. Especially with my last name, I always joke with my students. I come in the first day and say, "What do you guys think I am? Native? German? Anybody? Irish? I have that in my heritage, but, it's not really possible for me to walk away from being Native. I know some people can because if there's Smith or Johnson or something, and if they're like me, kind of pass, right? So it's it's not something I can walk away from, and I think it's something that I've dealt with every day of my life. Whenever I interact with people who are different, who don't know me,
right?
School was really horrendous. People just were outright, ooh, kind of stuff, and call me chief, and different iterations of my last name, Buffalo Feet, Buffalohead, Buffalo whatever, right? Or just Buff. And so, it was, and that was, St. Louis Park was probably one of the worst places, probably, in terms of that, because of, being in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade it's a really hard time to be a human being at that age.
Right.
So people are kind of mean, and
in general,
being the only Native person in the grade, and one of maybe 3 or 4 in the school, that was an easy target, and so that was really unpleasant. But I was always in it for the learning piece, and I showed them by just getting all A's all the time. It's like, well, you can call me a dumb Indian or whatever you want to, but I got an A average. What's your grade point average?
Right. And hopefully you've had some opportunities to teach their children.
So, I mean, and that's probably true, for my kids too. And, just the whole being a Native person and being an overt Native person. I mean, and it's different because, people never forget my name.
Right.
People come up to me, students I had 20 years ago will see me in the store or someplace, Home Depot or something. Professor Buffalohead. And it's like, I don't know who you are. And, I get hundreds of people in my class. And when did you graduate from Augsburg? 2003? Oh, okay. That was a long time ago. Sorry, I don't remember your name.
Yeah.
But they remember me. And people from high school remember me, too. I run into bald old men, and they talk to me, and I'm like, I don't know.
And you're like, I got my hair still, too.
I still got my hair. Look at this. It's gray now, but it's still here. It's better than what you got, right? So,
Karma.
So, yeah, there's a lot of people who were, real jerks to me.
Right.
Especially from around 4th or 5th grade through about 10th grade. That was a real hellish time to try to be the only Native person in my grade, and and that was in the 70s, and so there was all this segregation in schools. Well, we got 4 Indians in 4th grade, so let's make sure we got one in every class, whereas it might have made sense to have us all as a cohort together to support each other, right? But we just ended up being on an island by ourselves, and so I didn't think that was particularly the best plan, right? I don't disagree with desegregation of schools, but at the cost for Native people being such a small part of the population, it's an unintended consequence that nobody thought about until after the fact, I don't think. So, yeah, I mean, I think about it all the time, always around, and it impacts how I interact with people. I mean, I'm only been in Burnsville for a few years, and I'm still meeting neighbors and, white people. I'm Fred Smith, blah, blah, blah. I'm just like, I'm Eric.
Right. And then I assume with a last name like Buffalohead too, they assume you're Native, and then they want to tell you some story about their great 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 grandma who was Cherokee. Yeah,
they want.
And then you have to listen to it.
Yeah, some kind of thing, or they heard some kind of urban myth about something. I mean, it's just I teach American Indian history, and I want you to write a research paper on something you're interested in. And so there's always some kid from Red Wing or someplace. Then, we got this legend about this Dakota princess who jumped off the cliff into the river because blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, do you think any of that is real? Because, Dakota people, they weren't royalty, so they didn't have princesses. And why would a girl jump off a cliff into the river? I mean, it's just what's going on here? Can you find any academic sources that you can write that paper about? It's like, other than urban legend, if you can find me some academic sources, we can talk about this paper idea. But why don't you write something about something that actually happened? So I get all that kind of stuff, and then at work, people can find me, so I get bizarre emails about stuff. My grandpa has this tomahawk that I found in a shoebox from 1925, and I want to give it back to the right tribe. Well, how the hell should I know? Send me a picture of it. I'll see it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Dude probably bought it at a novelty store.
Right.
It has nothing to do with Native people. It was probably some trinket crap made in some other place. I mean, so I get these weird emails from people about stuff like I should know the answer to what tribe it was based on the shape of.
You should know everything about all the tribal nations.
So I mean, yeah, that's a weirdness, and so I just lay low with my neighbors. Hi, I'm Eric.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Cool.
I feel like
cool. I don't mind any of them, but it's really interesting because my neighbor would be right behind this wall. He's a Latino.
Okay.
And so he said when he moved here, which was 20 years ago, he was the only brown person in the neighborhood. And so that was an adjustment, he said.
Yeah, so you're taking the pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, it was funny. As soon as we moved in, they came over, some other brown people in the neighborhood. It's hilarious. And it's funny because they're probably our our closest friend and neighbors is them. I mean, I like the guy across the street that way. He's actually an Augsburg graduate from the 50s, so he always wants to talk about Augsburg. He's a really nice old guy, played hockey there, did all kinds of stuff. You know, Augsburg set his life in motion to put him in this perfect life, and, you know, he always wants to talk about it and stuff. I'm just like, okay, well, you know, it's probably really different than when you were there.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, so I went to Coon Rapids High School, and one of my high school teachers is Ojibwe, and now is one of the assistant coaches for football at Augsburg.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Rich Wilkie is his name.
Interesting.
But I think he's, his community, I want to say, is Turtle Mountain Ojibwe.
Okay. I don't think I know him. I don't know too much about the football team.
And I only know this because of Facebook, but I think he's only been in that role for maybe like 2 years, so it's still very new. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'll have to look him up.
Yeah. I just thought of that when you were talking about your neighbor across the road from Augsburg, too.
Yeah, because I mean, Augsburg is a really interesting place because people love it. You know, people who have graduated there, it's like this weird love that they have for it, and they just talk about how wonderful it was, and you know, and it's all this stuff, and it's like, well, that's cool. I mean, I guess I went to UW for 3 semesters, and then I went to the University of Minnesota for 3 more years after that to finish my degree. I can't say that I loved the University of Minnesota. I had some great times there. I met my wife there, but I can't say that I love the place the way like my neighbor across the street talks about Augsburg. I met my wife there, and my business partner, and my whole life was set up, and my whole life revolved around the relationships I made at Augsburg, and it's just like, he's a great old guy. I love him. He's a great old guy. It's funny, but he's just one example of the people I meet, you know, We're Augsburg people, and it's really interesting.
So, in thinking about cultural activities, were you involved in, or are you now involved in any cultural activities in the area? And growing up or even raising your family, is that something you went to Minneapolis to participate in, if at all? Or is that something that you would return to either your or your wife's tribal communities for?
Both. Yeah, I mean, my wife's from, her family is from Flanders, South Dakota. So we spent a lot of time there, and then at the lower Sioux and upper Sioux communities, as well as the Shakopee and Prairie Island, because those are family gatherings for her family, being Minnesota, Dakota. So we did a lot of powwows at those winter and summer. Certainly a lot of stuff in Minneapolis, art activities, music, powwows, the Indian Center, all that kind of stuff. In the St. Louis Park, Golden Valley area, there's nothing going on there really. I mean, it's either Minneapolis, St. Paul, or maybe some of the school districts have, like Osseo does a lot of powwow and stuff, and Anoka Hennepin used to. But other than that, there's not much going on in that West Metro as far as Native stuff is concerned, in my opinion. And Breck really didn't do much. Again, they had a day in chapel when they'd bring Native students who wanted to do a dance exhibition with a drum or something. They'd do that. Somebody might bring a teepee and set it up and talk about it or whatever, but not so much there. For me growing up, it was interacting in Minneapolis or St. Paul. And then again, I spent a long time out in Washington and Colorado, so I was gone for, a significant portion of time in between 4th and 8th grade. So out there it was, it was different. Lived in Pullman, which is where Washington State is. And so that was a strong Native area, actually. And Denver, when I lived in Denver, there's a lot of natives in Denver, but that was one of the most racist places I've ever been, living in Denver. And that could have just been, that was like 7th grade, 6th and 7th grade or whatever, and it's just, people are just not very nice at that age. But I'd say that was, I don't look back upon that time with any fond memories at all of being in Denver, other than the beauty of the mountains and but the people, I didn't like the people there at all. you know.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
And they were not very nice to me, you know. I mean, and again, as being a Native person, I'm an easy mark, Buffalohead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people, are you Native?
Yeah. I never really thought about, you know, we think about Native people like being visibly Native and that kind of racism, but I guess I hadn't really thought too much about when you have a really visible last name, like Buffalohead. And I did interview Grant Tubles on Monday, but he didn't speak at all really to any of these experiences with his last name.
Yeah, they gave him a lot of crap at Breck about
Yeah,
his last name.
he's also a bit younger, so maybe he hasn't really had time to think about it too much or reflect on it with where he is now.
Yeah, I mean, my sons were good friends with him, so it all came back to me about what they gave him a lot of crap.
Mm-hmm. And he also looks very visibly Native too.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Yeah.
yep, for sure. And so, so they were lucky. There was the three of them in that grade, Grant and my sons Eli and Ara.
Yeah.
So they had their own little 3-person cohort, you know. I mean, because Breck is small. I mean, the graduating class is like 100 people. So when you have a small class, it's, you know, it's not as bad as like me being one of 400 or something.
Right. Right.
You know, in my graduating class, one of 430 or something, right? And they're like 3 out of 100. So a third of them, you know, 1 out of every 33 is a Native. Is pretty good odds. But yeah, they you know, my daughter got hassled at Breck too by some kids with her last name too, saying just outrageous things to her and stuff. So it's hard to, you know, it's hard to you know, walk away from it. You know, like I know Native people who look like me who can walk away from it. You know,
Right.
I'm Fred Johnson, and you know,
Right.
I don't have to let you into my circle because I pass for somebody who's just obviously got something, but not necessarily, you know, a Native or something, right? But with the name,
Right.
there's no way you walk away from it.
Right. I would say going to school in Coon Rapids, I heard similar, like very racist things, but they weren't necessarily directed at me because I looked white. My name doesn't sound Native, but you still hear it and you observe it, and it's still awful, but it isn't that outright direct attack on you.
Yep, that's true. Well, unfortunately for me, it was a direct attack on me, you know. And I didn't get any support from teachers or administrators or anything. I mean, all they ever did was, oh, they tease you because they like you, and
Right.
you need a thicker skin in this world, and you know, there was just never any support, no matter what it was. I mean, it could be outrageous stuff like. 4th grade, we went to Como Zoo, or 3rd grade, I think it was 3rd grade, we went to Como Zoo, and there was a buffalo there at that point, right? And so my class, you know, 25 of us little 3rd graders are running around, and just as we get to the buffalo, and the buffalo does number 2, right? So the guy calls it buffalo chips. Oh, look, the buffalo's making chips. Well, guess who got called buffalo chips for the rest of the school year? You know, and I was just frank with my teacher. I'm like, you know, buffalo chips are shit. And so the kids are calling me shit. And you think that's a nice?
That's okay. Right.
Well, they're just teasing you. It's like, you know, and so it's like, well, okay. Yeah, no support there. No support from the administration in terms of, well, you know, I agree that chips is not the same word as shit, but it means the same thing in the context.
And it's not your name.
And it's not my name either. Right. So that was, you know, that's the kind of stuff I endured. Right. You know, just, and people felt perfectly fine doing that kind of stuff. No qualms whatsoever.
Right. And the adults too. I mean, they endorsed it.
Yeah. No problem with it whatsoever. Never thought twice about it. Right. And so that's, you know, really difficult thing to come to terms with. And, you know, so we had to kind of prepare the kids for stuff like that. It's like, you know, this is where the name comes from, and, you know, it has the significance, and, you know, anybody who spells it the way it's spelled, like one word, they're your relative. How many people can say that? You know, it's like Buffalohead, one word, the Poncas. Anybody you meet with that name is my relative. right? So how many people like that? And that kind of shuts people up. Like
Right.
Johnsons. Are you relatives to all the Johnsons? Do you know all the Johnsons? All of them? All 8 million of them in the world? So, you just gotta find ways to cleverly shut them up.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one thing I was really good at, was just basically shutting them up by, being smarter than them, or being more clever than them, not necessarily smarter, but being smarter about how to talk to them and to shut them up. And then, that's what I did. Right. So it's, it is what it is. I mean, it's given me a lot of ammunition for teaching.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to reflect on these things, I think, like as an adult, but if anything, it reminds us of the importance of educating people so that hopefully future generations don't also have to endure this. I mean, I know they're going to, because racism doesn't just go away, but hopefully it just gets better too.
Well, I mean, I think that what I think is we need to take away that power people have to feel like they can just do anything to us as natives because we've been so poorly portrayed by movies, and we're comic relief for sports teams, and it's just like they get this idea. Well, it must be okay. It must be okay. I mean, I see that in Bugs Bunny. I see it in the movies. It's
right.
You guys
it's funny.
You guys are mascots for a baseball team.
Right.
It's got to be fine. You must not be bothered by it because it's so acceptable. It's like, well, a couple of facts here. One, we're about 1% of the population. If we were 10% of the population, a lot of the stuff we're talking about wouldn't exist because it simply wouldn't be acceptable. But because we are such a small part of the population and segregated part of the population, then that void of us not being there is filled with the fantasy that Hollywood and advertising, sports mascots has so incredibly filled in.
Right. So thinking about Wakpadan, which is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek, what do you think about the role and importance of language and place names, particularly in these very white suburban areas?
Well, I think it's something that, certainly should be of much more importance. I think there should be a return to many of the place names, I mean, but that's so controversial. I mean, there was so much backlash to Lake Calhoun becoming Dave McCoska, right? There's still people who are upset about that. You're getting rid of history and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, we're just taking away an honor for someone who didn't deserve it.
The history is the same.
Because Henry Sibley High School here changed its name too. They're not Henry Sibley anymore. So people are all upset about that. And it's just like, well, maybe we should have, in the first place, utilized some of these names to refer to these places rather than imprinting our own stamp as Americans on everything, right? And so I think it's good to learn about these names, because Introduction to American Indian Studies, first day. How many of you guys know any native words? Don't know any, right? You know the state you're in right now?
Right.
So, that river right across over there? Mississippi. They just don't get it. They don't understand how so much native language in places and foods and animals and names of trees and place, all this that they use all the time, and they don't understand that.
Right. And they're okay with that.
Yeah, they're okay with that, but then you want to change the name of like we want to change the name of Murphy Park, but which is in the Augsburg campus, which is actually owned by the city of Minneapolis, but our campus surrounds it because we don't want it named after Murphy because Murphy was a squatter. He stole land from Dakota people, right? But there's the real, it's the oldest park in Minneapolis, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, so what? So what if it's the oldest park in Minneapolis, right? You're naming it after somebody who was a known squatter who stole land prior to the treaty for his own benefit, and his family and his descendants are still benefiting from that benefit. So do you think we should name something for him, or do you think we should come up with a better name that reflects maybe honoring the heritage of Native peoples that are around here, right? our president at Augsburg, he's all big on the land acknowledgement. I'm like, well, the land acknowledgement is fine, but why don't you guys go to the park board and say, we object to the name.
Right.
As the university. And we don't want to call that anymore because of the history. Well, I don't know if we can do that. Well, why not? Why not? Why can't we change the name of it? So I think it's great that we see return to some of these kinds of names. I wish there were more. Throughout the whole of the United States, not just, in a place like Minneapolis, St. Paul,
right.
where it's a little bit more acceptable. I wish throughout the whole of the United States, it should be, returning to these kinds of things and making people aware of the fact that there's already tons of stuff.
Right. Right.
Manhattan, come on. Where do you think that word came from? Appalachia. They don't even know those words come from languages of native peoples who were there. They don't know all these rivers, Allegheny, Potomac, Mississippi. They don't know any of this stuff.
Right.
They're just so ignorant. And then you want to change up a name of a lake because the guy was a jerk.
Right.
I don't like that much.
Right. Not just a jerk, but like some of these people are openly racist, slaveholders, genocidal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they just, I understand that at some point in history, they maybe were somebody who was looked up to. Okay, but we've come to terms with that history, and we realize that, hey, maybe we should put that on the back burner, not forget about it, but, maybe you should come up with something that's more inclusive of who we are in 2022 as opposed to who we were in 1822.
Right.
Right? But people, I mean, it's funny because I live in Burnsville, right? And so there's still people around here who are pissed that they changed the name of Burnsville's high school from the Braves to the Blaze back in the 90s. It's been
30 years.
25 years.
It's like one letter difference.
Yeah, they went from the Braves to the Blaze, because the school district wanted to be more inclusive, and having the Burnsville Braves was obviously racist and problematic, right? But there's still people who are upset about it. Right. They're really called Braves. Well, no, look at the side of the school. It says Blaze.
Right.
I remember when they were the Braves. We played them when I played for St. Louis Park High School football team. I remember when they were the Braves. But they're not that anymore.
And if you want to see everything that's wrong with that name, just turn on a baseball game, Major League Baseball.
Yeah. When we see the problems with it, we can show you, which real easy.
Yeah, in the 90s, though, to make that change was, I feel, was relatively early in the whole mascot name change came.
Well, Minnesota was pretty progressive, though. It was. I mean, back in, 96 or 7, they basically told all the high schools, we'd really like it if you would go away from those names, and many of them did, or most of them did, really. But, that's Minnesota. Minnesota's, what do you call it, passive-aggressive?
Oh, okay, yeah.
We'll change the name.
Minnesota nice.
Yeah, Minnesota nice. We'll change the name. We won't like it.
Right. They'll still remind you 30 years later.
We'll keep talking about it, but yeah, so people are still upset about that kind of stuff. Like, I see reading articles about people upset about Sibley High School changing its name to something. I don't know what they're going to call it now, but they're going to not. What Henry Sibley was this? It's like, well, you should really learn about Henry Sibley, right? You should learn about the guy who married a Dakota woman to take advantage of trade and had a child, and then when he got money, left them high and dry. That's a real good person to honor, somebody who
right.
used a Dakota woman, had a child with her to benefit himself, and then when he had made money off the swindling of the trees, and he left them high and dry. It's like, boy, did he really do that? Well, yeah, that's what he did. And his family is still benefiting from that. So it's like, I don't think they should probably have a building name for him, right? Or a street or anything else. But it's hard to get away from those names. Ramsey, Sibley.
Yeah, they're all over.
They're everywhere you look. And that's just here. And I don't even know the history of other places that, can only have so much information.
Right.
At one time. So people are, it's weird. But I think it's great. I mean, we just need to make sure we give some pronunciation guides. People, that's another thing. How do you say the name of that lake over what used to be Kowloon?
Yeah.
Makaska. It's not that hard. Mini what?
So, this American Indian Oral History Project grew out of a land acknowledgement process. What do you think about land acknowledgement statements? You've touched on them a little bit already. And after the work has been done to create a responsible and respectful land acknowledgement statement, what do you see as necessary and supplemental work to follow?
Well, I'm all for land acknowledgements. I think they're complicated though, because what do you mean? I mean, what are you referring to? You know, are you like Augsburg has the land acknowledgement, and it's like, well, do you mean the land we're on right now here in Minneapolis? Do you mean the Twin Cities? Do you mean the state of Minnesota? Do you mean the Upper Midwest? Because the bigger your sphere is, the more people you're going to have to acknowledge, right? And I think that's confusing to people and can cause tension in groups, right? So I think you have to be careful about. I think acknowledging what land you're actually acknowledging, right? Like I personally would say that when we do our land acknowledgement at Augsburg, I think you should say where the campus now sits.
Right.
We acknowledge that this was the former home of Dakota people who inhabited the area for whatever, right? But instead, it's more like Minnesota. So he says, Ojibwe and Dakota people, and it's like people are confused.
That's also why it's 3 pages long.
They came down and traded, but their homelands were a little farther north of here, right?
Right.
So it confuses people as to where certain tribes were or where their land base was. So I think it's a great thing, but I think you have to be, for my opinion, I think you have to be a little bit more specific about what you're saying. Are you saying Minnesota? Are you saying Wisconsin? Are you saying Madison? Are you saying Milwaukee? What are you saying in your land acknowledgement so that it actually represents the people who were there and doesn't become this generic thing? Here in the United States, Indians own the land. I mean, then it becomes kind of powerless, right?
Right. Hearing you say that also has me thinking that for the people and institutions that do a land acknowledgement statement that are more broad, it almost seems like it's a way to then also escape responsibility and obligation. Because you're like, oh, it wasn't just me. It wasn't just Augsburg. This was all of Minnesota where this happened, right?
Exactly. So I think, to me, I think they're really a good thing. I mean, it's certainly a far cry from where people just completely ignored the fact, or like when you watch documentaries on Channel 2 here in the Twin Cities about the founding of the Twin Cities. And nothing happened here before 1836, apparently. I mean, that whole situation. But I think the further thing that needs to happen, though, is that people need to understand the history of why there needs to be a land acknowledgement. I mean, they need information on the whole treaty making and how that was, highly problematic when you're signing treaties in a language that you can't read or speak, and and explaining concepts that you don't necessarily have words for in your language. And when you really take a deep dive into treaty making, then it really opens people's eyes. It's like, would you sign an agreement that you couldn't read, just relying on somebody else's interpretation of it? It's like, no, I would never do that. Well,
not to mention the way that alcohol was brought into these transactions as well.
Not to mention that natives don't really sign anything. It's an X. Some white kids could have got drunk in the woods and put that all together, and how would we know any different? I mean, it's not like you pricked your finger and there's blood on the thing, DNA that shows you were there. I mean, you don't know. I mean, and the whole, how do you even explain the idea of private property when people didn't even have that concept? That's ridiculous. Somebody could own the land. It was a ridiculous concept. So how was that explained to natives? I mean, if you, I've done a lot of work around Dakota interpretations of the treaties, and a lot of that's really about, we're going to agree to share the land with you. And you're going to give us these resources to make up for the fact that you're going to tax our ability to hunt deer or whatever it is in the area. So really what Dakota interpretations are, we're going to share the land. But the treaties say the United States bought the land, and that's a far different interpretation. So that whole cultural piece is how do you explain, how do you explain a cultural thing to somebody who doesn't have it right? I mean, it's easy if you do have it, private property. I'd say to any Americans, private property. Of course they know what it is, because it's a concept we have as a part of American culture. But, how do you explain that to somebody who wouldn't have that concept, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of background info on why land acknowledgements need to be made in terms of the whole treaty-making relationship and all of the problems that surrounded that with language and culture and if you think about people like Sibley and Ramsey, people had something to gain out of successful treaties, so that you end up with really different interpretations of what was agreed to from the Dakota side. Again, I'm thinking about the 1851 treaty versus what was negotiated by the Americans at Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, right? I mean, you listen to the Dakota oral history and what they wrote down about it after the fact. It doesn't sound anything like what the treaty is. But treaties are legally binding agreements that natives are stuck with, right? And then when it starts to benefit them in some way, then people are upset about it.
Right. Like that hunting and the fishing rights in Wisconsin. Or even fishing rights in Minnesota.
Yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean they don't have to follow the season? What is that about? What do you mean they don't need a permit? That's not fair. Okay, well, so what? It's a part of the legally binding agreement. You don't like it? Too bad, right? There's all these people who are ridiculous. Let's go back on the treaties. Let's do it. I'm all for it, because you know what? That 5 cents an acre that my tribe sold the land for, I can come up with that. I probably got that in my wallet right now to buy back my entire area that my family would have utilized. So it just shows people don't know anything about it, right?
Right.
And they think of it as, oh, well, you guys could have said no. Yeah, I suppose. Could have said no with a gun to our head.
Right.
Threatened to be run off the land.
Right. I mean, Native people would have been removed regardless.
Yeah.
Even if they did say no.
Do the best you could. Get the best you could get out of it, and that's what I think people tried to do in an ugly situation. But a lot of Americans don't have any clue about it. They have know nothing about treaties. Well, what's the fair agreement? And we paid you for the land. Well, how much do you think you paid us? And Indian people, they have no clue what that treaties were pennies the acre.
Right. And almost always they were never fulfilled.
Oh, and then they never paid it anyways.
Right.
Oh, here's some flour. Here's some bacon. So, eat that. That's we're not going to actually give you any money, right? So they just have no clue. So, I mean, to me, the land acknowledgements are a great step in the right direction. I think they need to be a little more concise about what they're talking about because, again, I think it can be confusing. But there has to be further education. Otherwise, it just becomes like, something that people say and people don't listen anymore.
Right.
And then the power is gone. People are just, thinking about what they're going to eat for dinner while they're doing the landing. Right. Rather than listening.
Right.
So we need more information. It's a start, but there's much more work to be done. And I think it should be more permanent than something that's simply read. Why not a plaque? Right on the side of the building. Like, I think there should be a big ass sign on the Augsburg campus that says that, right? Big ass sign. 20 by 20.
A lot of folks have also talked about land back as part of land acknowledgement statements.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, there's certainly a call for bringing and returning lands to tribes. I mean, if you look at the precedent that was set by World War II, for example, where we invaded Germany and then eventually returned the land, and invaded Japan and eventually returned the land. And here we are. We got invaded. Right? We got invaded, and we don't necessarily need the entirety of the continent returned to us, but, think about what the impact of so little land and how important that is to wealth in this country. Where would we be if we had been able to protect a reasonable amount of land for us to use, right? If they wouldn't have done allotment policy and, another 90 million acres gone and removal and just force the Cherokee and other people off their lands to, solve the slavery and other problems. You think about how much better economically we would be. And if we were better economically, we'd be healthier and socially, and, you know, have less issues around cultural trauma and historical trauma and stuff.
Right.
I mean, we could be in such a better place. And, you know, the key to wealth is land. And as long as we're, you know, going to be, you know, owning a small, tiny percentage of what we will formerly own, we're not going to change that much.
Right.
You know,
I think a lot about institutions and organizations that will donate money to Native causes, Native nonprofits. And that's their way of like fixing the problem. But it's never about like, let me give you land back. Because as you mentioned, the wealth is held in the land. People know the value. They're not going to give an acre, 5 acres, 10, 100 acres back. But they'll throw $100,000, $1 million. But never, it's never the land.
Well, yeah, and that's, you know, that's at the heart of the problem, and that people in the United States don't understand when it comes to natives. We've been saying for a long time, we don't want the money.
Mm-hmm.
The money comes and goes. We want the land, because the land is something that is permanent and that can be used to generate food and wealth and other things, whereas money will just comes and goes.
Mm-hmm. Like the Black Hills.
Proven over and over and over again. You know, here's some money, and, well, look out, Best Buy. Right? Because, I mean, that's the truth. I mean, you know, Poncas, we got a big land settlement in 66 or 68 or whatever, right? And so, you know, all of us got some money when we turned, well, my dad and others were adults, but I didn't get mine until I turned 18. And it's like, sure, but what am I going to do with this $2,000 when I'm 18 years old? You know, I'd much rather have 5 acres of land than $2,000. Because with 5 acres of land, I could build a homestead. I could live there. I could.
That $2,000 has been long gone.
That $2,000 was, you know, that lasted about a week. Went down to the car dealer and, you know, bought a nice used car. Back in the day, you could buy a nice used car for $2,000, right?
But that's also long gone.
Got me through college, that car, though. I had that thing for 5 years, and it was dependable, so it was a good $2,000 investment, right? But I would have much rather had the land,
right,
or $2,000 worth of land, because I'd probably still have that today, and I'd probably utilize it today, right? And it'd be something I could pass on to my children,
right,
or grandchildren. But money just, you know, it shows up, and then boom, it's gone. You need a water heater, you need a furnace, your car's broken, you know, put it towards student loans, something.
Right. I mean, it goes back into like the capitalist system.
Yeah. It's more, it's not even they gave it to you, it's more like they just lended it to you for a little bit. Make you feel good for a few days, and then, oh, it's gone. So, yeah, people just don't get it, right? You know, and I tell my students, and I tell people, it's like, it's about the land. It's about the land. And, you know, until we figure out some way to rectify some of those things, and things ain't going to be that different, right? I mean, it'd be great if companies would, you know, give land rather than money.
I had a conversation with a group of students recently, and I was talking about this project, and they were just, you know, they were like, well, when I think about the West Metro, I think about like Honeywell, and I think about, you know, these large Fortune 500 companies, General Mills, that have so much wealth, but also political power, but also land holdings. So they were like, well, what would it mean for those kinds of organizations to have a land acknowledgement statement and then to act on them? I'm like, that's a very good question, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it would speak a lot louder to me than, you know, funding things. I mean, obviously we need programs and people hopefully do good things with the money, but it's a short-term solution.
It is about the land, yeah.
Because it's a long-term problem and it's a short-term solution. And so we've been trying short-term solutions for a long time, and yeah, they're a short-term solution. Okay, so you're not hungry for 6 months, great. You know, but the reality is until we can find a way as Indigenous people to have a land base that can be a regenerative wealth
Right.
for us, we're just going to be in the same old spot, you know? And yeah, I wish that landing lines would go farther. I wish they would become actions rather than simply words.
Yeah.
But that's gonna be a long time coming if things like that happen, if you ask me. Because they know too, land as well.
Right.
You know, General Mills ain't gonna want to. We probably could afford to give up 10 acres. No, they're not going to.
Right.
We could use that money for something. We could use that land to build something else and make more money. So, you know, they understand it. So that's what stands in the way of, you know, real change, I think. And unless, you know, things get really weird or and something happens to force them to start acknowledging these things, you know, which I don't know what that would be, but that would, you know, that's kind of where things need to be, is how do we find a way to do that?
Right. So another question, this is taking an environmental turn. So coming back to the Wakpadan Bassett Creek watershed, is there any advice that you would like to give to those who help manage the watershed and surrounding area today, or any particular initiatives that you would like to see?
Any advice or initiatives? Well, I mean, I guess I'm for protecting, you know, as much as we can do moving forward. And I would like to see, you know, restoration of native plants and grasses in places where possible. Obviously, you can't do that everywhere, but, you know, it'd be good to try and do some good things to Mother Earth as opposed to continually doing bad things to her. I'd like to see that, you know, and I think it would be good to, you know, involve and get input from more Indigenous folks, you know, who have a vested interest in the area historically or contemporarily, to get their perspectives and their wishes and wants for the area, you know, because I just I'm skeptical of mainstream Americans doing anything other than taking advantage of the area for their own purposes, rather than, you know, seeing it as a resource that should be there for all, like our Indigenous relatives would have thought about it. You know, it's not yours, it's not mine, it's ours, right? We hear that all the time. And I think of mainstream Americans as, well, I really like, you know, I like my view, and so no, I want to build my deck, and I want to put my gazebo here, and, you know, it's all about me. So I would like to see, you know, things at some point return to some kind of more traditional nature, whatever kind of I mean, obviously not in the whole thing, but where you could. That would be something that would be desirable, because I think we've, you know, taken so much advantage of the earth that we need to start thinking about how we're going to turn that tide around, rather than just continuing to use, or there ain't going to be no more human beings. And people just don't listen. I mean, you know, I just have to laugh because people are all complaining about the gas prices. $4 a gallon. It's like, well,
but they're still driving the same amount.
We were warned of this in the early 1970s. Had we taken that advice in 1974 or 75, dove into electric vehicles and solar power, would be in such a better spot than we are now. But no. We don't want to do that. We want to just continue to burn as much fossil fuel as we can do until it's all gone. It's like, you know, it's like, I know this guy I know, he's like, well, we should just mine and find as much oil as we can anywhere in the United States. It doesn't matter whether it's nature preserve or not. It's like, well, yeah, that would be another short-term solution to a long-term problem, which is just going to make it worse and worse in the end. It might make gas go down to 380 instead of 420, but
temporarily.
What's it going to mean for, you and I talked to this guy. So, I said, that's a short-term solution, because what I want is I want my grandchildren's grandchildren to have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. And that solution is not going to lead to that.
Right.
Well, what do you mean? It's like, well, get some education, my friend.
That's when your eyes roll back.
Just like, yeah.
Yeah, it is depressing. Other folks that I've talked to have shared about how polluted Bassett Creek is, but in many ways it's also like so tangible. Like if we can start small, but then we're up against people that are pro fossil fuels, and the damage that does so widespread.
Well, and not just that, all the chemicals we use everywhere, and we're just destroying the water. I mean, it's like, how are we going to continue to be as human beings if we don't have clean water to drink?
Right.
I mean, how are we going to live with no clean air to breathe? But I don't care. As long as my gas prices are good while I'm here.
Right.
It's like, well, that short-term view on humanity is what's led us to where we are right now, right? And that's just not a long-term solution that's viable. I mean, fossil fuels. We should have heeded the advice in the 70s. Think about it. It was 50 years ago.
Right.
Where we could be. I mean, everybody could have solar panels on their roof and charging stations for electric cars, and we could have developed the batteries by now that you could charge your car and drive it for 4 days and stuff. But nobody wanted to do that. Let's just keep milking the fossil fuels because people are getting rich off it and making a lot of money, and let's just keep doing it. It's like, okay, well, eventually it's going to run out. Then what are you going to do? Right.
I mean, it is really depressing.
Yeah, I mean, it is. But the thing is that we still have the power to...
Right. We can.
Not necessarily fix it, but turn it in another direction.
Right.
But you don't do it by being a follower, I mean, and this is an argument I get into with people all the time about the United States. We're supposed to be a world leader, then why aren't we leading? Why are we following, right? We're not leading, we're following. We're not a leader. If we were a leader, we would have embraced electric power for cars and solar power decades ago and led with it, right? But we're not. So don't tell me that we're leading the world in anything except the ability to blow it up. So it's depressing, I mean, I think it's disheartening, but I think about what my ancestors were thinking about 100 years ago, being removed from Nebraska to Oklahoma, and people are like, well, it's only a few hundred miles, but yeah, it's another world. It's another world. Northeastern Nebraska is like Minnesota, and I tell you what, Oklahoma ain't nothing like Minnesota environmentally. Plants, animals, resources, the climate.
Right.
Being moved to another world, and so. I guess we're all going to have our problems we got to deal with. It's just how do we move forward with it? I hope that, by teaching this generation of students and letting them understand and see the mistakes and see the wisdom that we had to offer as Native peoples, that maybe they can be those difference makers down the road who will make some kind of difference, because it's just like, it's funny, telling them about my people, the Ponca. We lived in these things called earth lodges by the rivers, and it was really cool because we didn't need any heating or cooling. What a great idea. You think?
Yeah. As we just hit the 90s in early May.
You think having a semi-subterranean, the ultimate in green housing that my ancestors and other people's ancestors had hundreds of years ago, I think it was a good idea. I kind of do too. As opposed to, I'm going to spend $400 on gas this month to heat in my house because it's 20 below, and $300 on energy to cool my house because it's 95 degrees above. It's interesting how the students react to stuff like that. Because they don't know nothing about natives.
Right.
Oh, an Earth Lodge. What's an Earth Lodge?
We all lived in teepees.
What's that? What's an Earth Lodge, anyways? Well, what does it sound like? So, yeah. We'll be all right, though. We'll get it done.
So the last question, is there anything else that you would like to share that we did not touch on?
Nah, I'm good. I think we had a really great, engaging conversation about a lot of interesting stuff. So hopefully it's some good information and goes into the archives, and maybe somebody will get some use out of it someday, I hope.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Naya chopna becha wopira tanka unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopna becha wopira unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening.